much for being part of another symposium. And like I told you, I sent a message that the symposium wouldn't have been complete without you. So, Andrea, a bit about yourself, and then we'll go to that little introduction that I have to do. Then after that, we'll get into the session. Please.
I'm starting to think now, Vikram, people will be sick listening to me. So I suppose, obviously, my name is Andrea O'Neill and I'm from Ireland. I'm a mediator, but that incorporates a lot of different things. I'm also a conflict coach. I also facilitate dialogue. So I do loads of different things, but it's all based from the core of mediation and what mediation is. I'm a member of the Mediators Institute in Ireland and I sit on their council. So that involves a lot of exciting stuff around the development of mediation in Ireland. And in the last year, I've been involved with as part of my role in the Mediators Institute in Ireland, I've been involved with a collaboration with the Irish Red Cross around Ukrainian people coming into Ireland and trying to help with things that might be, presenting difficulties, I suppose. So that's been a very interesting piece of work. And it's also something that I suppose opens new pathways for mediation that we might have never even thought about or discussed before. The other thing is I'm a member of Mediators Beyond Borders International, and my introduction there came through Ken after we did a presentation with Tatiana, who is a mediator based in Ukraine. And I'm working with them at the moment doing some work around trauma for people, mediators both in Ukraine and then mediators across the world who are dealing with the influx of refugees coming in from all sorts and how they face trauma and how they can deal with that. And of course, then I'm part of your symposiums, Vikram, and that has led me down a very interesting path that led me on a path of discovery to loads of topics that probably didn't get as much attention as they should have got. So I suppose that's me in a nutshell. Around mediation, I do family, I work with separating couples, I work with organizations, I work with workplace. So I suppose anywhere that my skill set can help people connect together I'm happy to work in. So I suppose that's me in a nutshell.
We definitely don't want to put you in a nutshell and you're not going to fit into a nutshell. There's so much more happening there. But what I basically need to do, of course, the fact that the thing on discussion that we're going to have mediators and the war in Ukraine, which of course, I'm sure you have circulated the information. So that's coming up on the 24th because that's the day Russia invaded Ukraine. So that's going to happen. And of course, on mediatorvikram.com, you find information as to what's happening. Okay, ma'am, Andrea, so have you circulated the information on this? Are we getting some
I have
people?
actually. Yeah, I have. I've sent to a number of mediators who are based in Ukraine. So I'm just waiting on word back to see who's attending and who's not attending. So, perfect. I mean, we might have people that just pop in on the day as well.
Yeah, but it's like a walk-in thing. Just give your experience. It's like they don't have to spend the entire time. Of course, World Mediation Circle support edutainment. Various previous years is also here. So I'll just leave it there. And Andrea, it's you and language and mediation. So please.
I'll just share my screen here if I can. Right now. Okay. So I'm not going to pretend to be a linguistic expert. So, I mean, as always, I'll speak from my own experience around language in mediation and what that has meant for me and the journey of the language of mediation for me as a mediator. So I suppose it's really best for me to speak to that because that's what I know. And then just to kind of relate it back to mediation and I suppose the mediation mindset. So I'm going to look at development of language. So I'm looking at this from the perspective, and I know other people have looked at it from different perspectives and some things will overlap here, but I'm looking at it as mediation actually is a language. When I suppose my thinking around that is when I went into mediation, into the classroom, and I know you don't like that, Vikram, but into the classroom for mediation, or to, you know, to understand what it was to be a mediator, learn to be a mediator. Part of my mediation training was that everything was done through a reflective practice lens. And I was actually looking back over some of those journals because I'm doing a training course with Michael at the moment. And I looked back over a couple of my old reflective journals. And one of the things I had on it is, this is like learning a new language. And I hate learning languages. So that was my biggest struggle with mediation. I understood the heart of it. I understood the soul of it, but it was the whole language of mediation that I struggled with, and how to change the language. And I suppose I had a mental block around languages from the time I was in school. I had done French and German at school, but I was rubbish, really rubbish at them. So again, I came up against this mental block when I went in to learn about mediation. It was, you know, remembering kind of, you know, at that stage, I thought I had to remember these questions, remember these phrases, remember these things. And so we're going to look a bit at that today, becoming comfortable with different dialects. So I suppose really what I mean about that is, in mediation, we change the dialect depending on the audience. So if we're thinking of it as a language, if we are going into a workplace mediation setting, we'll probably use different language than if we go into a situation where there's a separating couple, you know, so we'll have to change the language to form the connection. So it's about knowing those different dialects and understanding them, and then becoming comfortable with those. So actually knowing that other people communicate in a different way and understanding their dialect and not trying to translate it into your dialect. And then also looking at when language is not appropriate in mediation. And I know probably a couple of people have touched on that as well, but I think it's an important thing to look at. So I came across this paper, and probably people who are in the linguistic end of things will think, you know, this is a very common paper and everybody has read it, but I just kind of came across when I was doing a little bit of research for this. And it's by Krashen and Tyrrell. It's 1983. You can Google it. The paper's available online. And in that paper, there's 5 stages of language development identified. So pre-production. So during this stage is normally when, you know, we're just in the classroom, we're listening to the new words. We're not comfortable, we're using them, we're just getting familiar with them. So like when you go into the mediation room or into the mediation classroom, you're listening to these new words and you know, you're not quite comfortable with them. So the early production, so you start to practice the new words. So, I mean, for me, that practice of the new words probably originally started, we're in the classroom when maybe you were doing role plays or things like that. And then speech emergence. So your vocabulary is starting to expand, and you're starting to use longer sentences and get more comfortable with it. But then the intermediate fluency is when you're actually incorporating it into your day. So within your own language. So maybe for me, it was when I went home, I started incorporating the mediation language with my family or with friends, or, you know, testing it out, getting comfortable and feeling what people's reaction was to it. And then the advanced fluency is, it really is where you're using reflective practice and understanding why certain language worked in a mediation and why it didn't work, and what you needed to change it, and how could you change it, and would that suit another mediation. So really understanding how the language you used in a mediation worked, and, you know, that it's the fluency. So you're thinking in the language, it's part of your mindset. It's like there's been a paradigm shift. It's no longer just words. It's a whole new way of thinking. And you can actually think in that language as opposed to translate it and then say it, if that makes sense, Vikram.
Absolutely. Yep.
So again, this whole thing about becoming, you know, comfortable with different dialects. So if we look at the word dialect, it is defined as versions of a single language that are mutually intelligible but that differ in systematic ways from each other. So it's understanding that, you know, might have the same meaning, but might be said in a different way. And I mean, one of the things I have there is like, so Vikram, you might say to me, you know, if I call to your home, you might say to me, would you like some tea? If you came to my home here in Ireland, I'd say to you, do you fancy a cuppa? So it's the very same thing. I'm asking you, would you like a cup of tea? But to connect within my culture, my home, what I'm familiar with, I would say, do you fancy a cuppa? So I suppose when we come into the mediation room, we have to be conscious that language is not just purely translatable, that it actually is part of a culture, how we connect with people, where our language is based on our culture, is based on vocabulary we're used to, based on the meaning we put behind that vocabulary. So it's so much bigger than just words. And I think that is so important when we're looking at language and mediation. And again, it's about, the mediator, I suppose, as Michael would describe it, as the novice mediator, or the mediator who is still kind of progressing. Is we're trying out with family and friends, we're reflecting on it, we're trying to understand why it works, why it doesn't work, and then understanding people's difference, so that when we use words, it's not based on our interpretation of what those words are, but have an understanding that when that word hits the other person, it's actually their interpretation of the word, not ours. So although we use words and we're using them in what we understand them as, and our perspective of them and our culture of them, that language can mean something else to somebody. And we have to be conscious as a mediator that the language you use is what it's received and interpreted as, and not what we necessarily intend for. So we always have to check in that it's that we understand the language that is being used to us, and that the participants understand the language that we're using towards them. So I was away last week for a few days, and there was a long haul flight involved in it. And on one of those journeys, actually the one homeward bound on, I watched the life story of Charlie Chaplin. And of course, in my head was that we were going to be discussing, different aspects of language and things like that. So I was kind of looking through the lens of language and mediation as I was watching the movie. And as he's been interviewed, one of the comments he makes is, the voice is beautiful, but not as great as silence. And I thought that can be so true in so many mediations. And I suppose the little kind of diagram I have down here, or the little kind of picture of the guy flying out the cage. And I think it was Ken, I could be corrected, in a conversation we were having, and he was talking about words can nearly create a prison for the meaning. So again, about that interpretation of the word, if we just think of that word inside ourselves, we put like a barrier around it. But when we open the door to that word and allow for what it means to somebody else, well, then it opens up a whole new area for us to explore, because we're not just exploring it from our interpretation, but also from the participants that are in the room, and understanding it for them. It's like, I suppose, Vikram, sometimes I'm not a lover. I know, in mediation processes, people do ground rules. I'm funny about ground rules, because I feel rules are there to be broken. And the other thing I feel about rules is you're nearly saying to, these two human beings that are in front of you, I don't trust you to behave yourself in this room, so I'm going to give you rules to follow. So I don't like that term, ground rules. So there again, the language has to change. So for me, when you say ground rules, you're, I suppose, assuming that they won't behave within the mediation room. And to me, that's not what mediation is about. So for me, if I'm setting up, what I will always ask people in the room, they come into me, what will help you to have a conversation today? What will help you have the discussion that you need to have today? So how does that person, what might trigger you in this conversation? And so it's the same concept really as ground rules, but coming from a different perception or perspective, I should say. So that's another place, say, where language is really, really important in mediation. And one of the other things was interesting when I was actually went into the classroom to learn mediation. And I don't say learn mediation because I think it's something, it is a mindset, but I think like a language, somebody needs to give you maybe a couple of the grammar points so that you can communicate. But I think in that paper that I discussed earlier on, one of the things, the findings was that there has to be a natural way of learning a language, that students learn a language better when they're immersed in it, and that actually the grammar doesn't matter. If we bring students into a classroom and we teach them just the grammar, what happens is that doesn't build up the communication piece, and actually they more than likely will fail in the communication piece if we just do the grammar piece. Where if we allow people to communicate and try things out and reflect back on what worked and what didn't work without pulling them up on the grammar the whole time, that actually the communication piece, that building of connection and forming connection, is really what's important in learning a new language and what helps to develop that fluency in another language. The other thing that's important about that environment for learning this new language of mediation, that a new mediator, a novice mediator might be introduced to, is that the person or the instructor or the trainer or the teacher, whatever name we want to give the person who is providing the classroom environment, what is really important is that they pick topics that are of interest, that they allow a space where there is a low anxiety, so people are not worried about trying out their new skills. That there's a sense of reflection where they can look back and see why something worked and didn't work. And I mean, these are all the things. I wrote a paper as my thesis for my master's on reflective practice and how it is one of the main vehicles in transformative learning. And it's all about creating this environment in the classroom, this environment of being able to try stuff, this environment of being able to get things wrong and feel safe around getting things wrong, being able to reflect back on those things, allowing yourself to kind of bring about a self-awareness in it. And this is really parallel. This is parallel to what they're saying in the paper about learning a new language. It's parallel to what we do when we're in a mediation room for a really, I suppose, in a mediation learning environment where it's about transformative learning. It's about changing a mindset. It's about developing the mindset of a mediator, as opposed to just a skill set or a process. So what I found interesting about, I'm sure I don't need to explain to anybody who Charlie Chaplin is. I'm sure everybody kind of knows he was the king of silent movies, and he's an interesting background. Actually, he has some Irish descent in him, and he actually holidayed in a place called Waterville in Kerry. And what is interesting about Charlie Chaplin is that he came from very humble beginnings, and I mean, he was traumatized as a child. His father had abandoned him. His mother ended up with mental health issues, and he ended up in a workhouse. And then, long story short, he ended up going into an acting career. And really, I suppose, what does this mean, in relation to mediation is Charlie Chaplin took on a role as the tramp. So we'd no language, so there was no boundaries. There was no nationality. There was no, there was no religion actually until he played the role in a film called A Dictator, where he played the role of a Jew in it. But previous to that, he was universal. So he was accepted by all cultures. He was accepted as a connection to everybody because he didn't belong to anybody. So I really think as a mediator, when we go into the room, we're a bit like Charlie Chaplin in a way. I mean, so look, there's some parts of Charlie Chaplin that I necessarily wouldn't want to be like, but there is parts of that sense of being, of a non-identity, of not identifying with anybody in particular, not identifying with a particular culture, not identifying with a religion, not identifying with a thing. And that's not to say we don't have them ourselves, but when we're in the role of a mediator, we're there to form the connection and not as part of the identity. But in I picked on 2 films, right, just to show different aspects of mediation. So there was a film that he produced, and he produced most of his own films, called The Tramp and the Flower Girl. And really the story behind this film, it was a silent movie. He really did not want to go in when sound came into movies, into motion pictures. He really resisted going into that because he just felt it was a fad and it was going to, it was going to go in a short time. So he was sticking with the silent movies. But in this movie, The Tramp and the Flower Girl, he took this scene, this particular scene, the photograph where the flower girl is actually blind. So she can't see that he's a tramp. And she's handing him a flower. And the whole idea of the scene is this connection between the tramp and the flower girl, and she can't see who he is. But he shot this piece of the movie, I think, over 500 times or something, because he couldn't get it right. He changed the actress because was something just was not right about it. And it wasn't until where he was shooting it, there was a noise or something. And he went, that's what's missing. And actually what he did, if anybody goes back and watches the film, he climbs into a car, a gentleman's car. He climbs out the side of it and he bangs the door. And that gets the flower girl's attention. And she connects with him. The connection is seen as being better there because she sees him as a gentleman and she's given him the flower. So by creating a sound, he formed a connection. And he wasn't happy with that piece of film until such time as that door slammed. And what that door slamming did, it created the connection between the story, which was that she presumed he was a gentleman because of where he walked up. The connection, she was blind, she couldn't see who he was, but the sound allowed her to, I suppose, see who maybe he wasn't actually, because he was still the tramp, but her perception was that he was a gentleman because he was getting out of a car. So in that situation, it was important to have sound. It was important to have an interaction. The connection wasn't there from the start. And I think sometimes when we go into the mediation room, if there's not a connection, we need to look at why isn't there connection? Is the language not right? Is there sound? Is there too much sound? Is there, we need to reflect on it and look. And a bit like Charlie Chaplin in the movie, by reflecting, and it took him over 400 takes, 2 different actors, to realize I actually need sound here to form a connection. And when we're in that mediation room, sometimes we have to, question ourselves, why am I not connecting? As a mediator, I'm not connecting here. Or as participants in the room, I don't feel the connection. Why am I not feeling the connection? What's missing? What do I need to change my language? Do I need to change my body language? Do I need to actually shut up and allow them the space to figure things out? And I think that's really important. The other part, the other side of the coin, I suppose, is one of the last movies that Charlie produced was his first movie, I suppose, other than the door slamming. The first movie with sound was The Dictator. I think it was 1939. I could be corrected on that. But it was about a dictator, obviously thinking of the time, it was based on Adolf Hitler. Interestingly enough, they were born 4 days apart. They had similar backgrounds. Both fathers had an alcoholic background. Both had idolized their mothers, and both felt they had been hard done by in some way, where Chaplin took one approach to work his way and work with people, and obviously Hitler went a different way. But at the end of this scene, it's actually very powerful at the end of this film, where Charlie he's playing 2 parts in it. He's playing a Jewish barber and he's playing the dictator in the film. But at the end of it, they mistake the Jewish barber as the dictator. And he goes up to give a speech and he has all the stuff on and everybody presumes he's the dictator. And he goes up and he makes this really powerful speech that was actually used in Roosevelt's 3rd inaugural gala. And I actually have it here. I'll show it to you now in a second. But what happened from that then, Charlie got a sense of, oh, people want to hear me, people want to say. It was a powerful, powerful speech, and people wanted to listen to it, they wanted to hear again. But that led him down a different path, and suddenly he had found his voice, and he was talking in, he was being brought into communist discussions, and it was around the time of Cartyism, and suddenly then, the whole communist paranoia was going on at the time, and suddenly he was being investigated for being, I suppose, part of this communist thinking, part of this, fear of communism that was coming into the US at the time. And so he was being watched really carefully. So here he actually, I suppose sometimes as mediators, our ego, when we do something and we use our language and it's powerful and it works in a mediation room, we can go, oh, okay, this is brilliant. I'm actually really good at this. I'll go and I'm going to use this in the next mediation, and this is really good. And we start using it, and the ego gets big, and then what happens then is the ego gets bigger than actually what's happening. And to some extent, that's what happened. People might disagree with me. In some extent, that's what happened to Charlie Chaplin. He was being heard. He was being asked to speak at these places for a man who'd been silent for so long. And he wrote some great pieces, and even music and everything else. But he had his downfalls too. So people start concentrating then on his downfalls. They start looking at what he was doing wrong. And a lot of what he had done right and he achieved was pushed aside. So I think as mediators, we have to be very careful that our ego doesn't change the way people see us or perceive us, and that we remain grounded in our own values. So his values at the start, we said, was about silence, and about silence being such a powerful thing, but in some ways he forgot that himself. He moved away from his own value, and he paid a price for that, so much so that he went, I think he was going for I think there was one of his films were being premiered in Europe, and himself and his family were traveling over to this premiere, and they revoked his citizenship in the US at the time. And so he had to go and live in Switzerland. So it had consequences for them. So I think we have to be careful of that we don't get caught up in, that language doesn't get caught up in our ego and everything else, and be careful of that as mediators. And then looking at, you can Google these benefits of silence. I haven't done a research paper on it. I haven't looked. If you go into Google and just go, the benefits of silence, a huge amount of information will come up. But one of the things that comes up is that it relieves stress, and it reduces cortisol and adrenaline. And they reckon that 2 minutes of silence is better to your mind than calming music. So if you can imagine in a mediation room when things are getting hot and bothered, and language is flying left, right, and center, and it's getting to volatile language and everything else, for us to break that and take, a bit of time out, or to allow for a bit of space, or to actually just sit with it for 2 minutes, or ask the parties, do they need a break, and allow them 2 minutes or 5 minutes of silence, that can actually bring everything down. It can bring down, it can actually reduce blood pressure, can reduce so many things. The other things that silence does is it boosts creativity. So when we're in the mediation room, we're trying to get the people in the room to actually explore options for themselves, to brainstorm, to be creative, to figure out what will work for them without our direction. And actually, by allowing silence in the room, we can help boost that creativity, because their mind quiets them down, and they can see the different pathways. If you think of our mind like a forest, and we're stuck behind a tree, and we can't see a way out. Where if we actually calm it down and we quiet the noise around us, we can actually see different ways around the trees and find our way back to the path, or to a different path. So it's important to understand that silence is a language in mediation as well. And it also provides an opportunity to look in the mirror. So I'll give you an example. I was doing a mediation going back, it was actually last year, and it was 2 people were in a room, and it actually got quite, I won't say, it got volatile, I suppose. And one person was stronger in the room than the other. So I decided to, allow time out for a break as such. And so the person who was quieter in the room said, do you mind if I go outside and step outside? And I said, no, go ahead. The other person who had been more verbal and I suppose would have maybe come across as aggressive, but actually they weren't aggressive. They were fearful. Do you know what I mean? But it came across as being aggressive. I just sat in the room with them and I handed them a bottle of water. I didn't say anything. And handed them the water and they sat for a few minutes. And then they looked up at me and they said to me, am I aggressive when I behave like that? Does that come across as being aggressive? It was like as if somebody suddenly held up the mirror to them. Now, I could have handed them the bottle of water and said, well, how do you think that person felt when you said that? What do you think they might have assumed you meant when you said that? I could have taken that approach. Or what was their assumption when you said that? What was their assumption when you said something like that? What might that felt like for them? Right? So you could have taken that approach while they were taking the drop off, but I didn't, because I needed to allow the adrenaline to go down. I needed to allow the cortisol to go down. I needed to allow that time to let them settle back into their own mind. And actually, they held up a mirror for themselves. I didn't have to ask any questions. They came back, they were gone. And when the other person came back into the room, without me asking anybody or the other person asking for anything, they went, I'm sorry. I actually didn't realize. That must have come across as quite scary or aggressive. And nobody asked a question. Nobody put them in that direction. It was the few minutes of time and actually just to sit with that person in that moment and allow them figure that out themselves. And when we figure things out for ourselves, it's much more powerful than somebody asking us questions or pointing it out for us, because we've found the path ourselves. It's like when you're on the road and you're driving somewhere, Vikram. If you find your way there yourself, you'll remember the next time. Where if you're following Google Maps, you won't remember it. You'll have Google Maps in front of you and you're just doing it automatically. Turn with Google, say, turn right here. In the next 20 meters, turn left here. At the roundabout, take the third exit. You're not going to remember that. If you figure that out yourself, if you look at the map and figure that out yourself, you're going to remember that much more than if you have somebody. So the mediator is Google Maps. We'll get them there, but they won't remember it the next time. So sometimes we have to allow them to do that. And I think that's what's important about silence as well in mediation and as a language, as a part of our language. So I think silence is part of the mediation language, as well as our non-violent communication, as well as our heart-to-heart communication, as well as our understanding emotions. And I know you don't like books, Vikram, I have to show you this book. I got this book as a present. I don't know if that'll come up back to front. It's called An Emotional Dictionary by Susie Dent. And it gives fabulous explanations for emotions. It's not like a dictionary you've ever seen before. And I think that's where we have to be going with language in mediation. It's about understanding emotions, about understanding other people's description of emotions and feelings, and not necessarily just our words and our language. So there's one here, I love this one, right? Confelicity, a pleasure in another person's happiness. Most of us have heard of Schadenfreude. I'm sure I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. The one word German articulation of the pleasure we take in someone else's pain. Few, however, know of a word for its far nicer flip side, finding joy in another person's happiness. Gratifyingly, one does exist, and its pleasure to catch on is as surprising as it is regrettable. You may find confelicity in watching children open their Christmas stockings or in their nervous smiles during their first nativity. And I just kind of think this is the kind of language we need in mediation, this kind of emotional language, understanding it, but understanding that it's not the words like, so does that make you feel happy? Like, describe to me how that makes you feel. Where do you feel that? When you feel that, where do you feel that in your body? That language is not just a word. It's not just a description, but it's part. We might feel it in our chest. We might feel it in our heart. We might feel it in our stomach, So when somebody describes, if somebody's describing maybe fear, I'm using the word fear, and they might describe, you know, I just get all, when they come in, I get all, you know, jittery, and I go to, where do you feel? I feel in my stomach. And what happens when you feel it? Have you felt it there before? And they might bring it back to something that happened when they were a child. And suddenly we've allowed that language to develop from fear to discover what that means to them, where they feel in their body. Have they felt it before? And what we're doing is we're helping them form connections between the past, the present, and the future by the language we use. And I think that's what's so exciting about language and mediation, and that it's not just restricted to the ordinary Weber dictionary or the other dictionaries. It's this type of emotional type of dictionary. You know, it's this one that goes into the deep meaning, where we look at where we feel it, where we experience and everything else, and know that everybody's feeling or word or language has a different interpretation, even if it's like we have a general understanding. It's like when we go into the classroom, the mediation, what they're teaching us is the general, the grammar, maybe the pronouns, the adjectives, the thing. But what we're doing as a mediator with the mediation mindset is we're developing that. So the classroom gives us the confidence to maybe use our mediator mindset in the work that we do. So this is just to finish up, just because I couldn't do without saying it, looking at, I hope I'm not going over time, Vikram.
No, you've got enough time. You've got enough time. You've got another 25 minutes.
Looking at Charlie's speech, this famous speech I was talking about, and I decided, when I read through it, which was interesting, when I came back, I was talking to my son, who actually traveled to Cambodia yesterday. He's going to live there for 6 months. But I was talking to him about this movie. We were having a conversation about it. And I was talking about this speech at the end. And he was able to rattle off the last paragraph of that speech. And I was going, how do you know that speech? I hadn't come across it before. And he was going, no. He says, I was fascinated. There's a piece about animals in it. So he says, I was fascinated by that piece because he's obviously, that's the area of his work. And but we got into discussion around this. And the more I looked into it, I was going, really, you know, looking at the persona of Charlie Chaplin, the tramp, and looking at us as mediators. So the start of the speech is, I know I won't read it all. I just read the pieces I've highlighted. Just by way of introduction, I'm sorry, I don't want to be an emperor. That's not my business. And I think really as a mediator, we don't want to, we're not the judge, the jury. We're not there to actually determine what's going to happen to you. We don't own your conflict. That conflict is your property. We're actually there. That's not our business. You know, we don't want to conquer you. So, I mean, I know around this whole kind of, you know, stringent framework that might be coming into mediation, but we have to be very careful that we as mediators are not going to move from being, you know, the person who allows a safe space for dialogue and conversation, that we don't try and become the emperor. We don't try and become the judge, because that is not our business. You know, we want to help everyone. So I should like to help everyone if possible. Jews, Gentile, black man, white. So we have no judgment. We don't care what your cultural background is. We don't care what your life experience has been. We want to be there to help you have the conversation that's going to help you move forward in your dispute. We all want to help one another. Human beings are like that. We want to live by each other's happiness, not by each other's misery. And that goes back to my word in the dictionary, the emotional dictionary. And I think that's really important, because really, you know, people would often say to me, how do you do that work? Like, why would you want to sit in between other people's arguments? Why would you want to be that? Do you not take that all home with you? And I think to a certain extent, you do take some of it on board. But I think really what I get out of mediation, and I think as mediators, we do gain stuff from being a mediator. There is a give back to us as well. And I think that give back is that sense of watching connection build between two people. I remember watching, again, this was a family dispute. and there was a disconnect between two parents, and they weren't separating or anything like that. There was a disconnect between two parents. And in one of them, for the first time, one of the parents heard the other person in a true way, I suppose, for the first time. And they just gently put their hand on their knee, on their partner's knee. And like that, again, there was no words. But in that moment, I remember thinking, wow, they had really struggled for a long time. And that simple thing of that person putting their hand on the other person's knee and going, oh, I didn't get it, but I get it now. And I think that's what we take. That's what I take when I come out of mediation. That's the give back to me, is when that connection is formed and you've helped form that connection. Again, we think too much, we feel too little. And I think that's very true. And I mean, we have to be careful of that in mediation, that we don't let the thinking take away from the feeling. That it is part of it. We do have to think, we have to reflect back. We have to understand the theory, and the theory complements our mediation mindset and helps us develop our mediation mindset and everything else. But we have to remember that it's about feeling, it's about the heart, it's about the connection. More than machinery, we need humanity. So again, the machinery of mediation, the frameworks we need, the processes we need, and we need all those things. But more than that, we need humanity, we need connection. More than cleverness, we need kindness and gentleness. And, you know, Vikram, for anybody that goes into a mediation room, especially, like, there's always emotion, whether it be workplace, whether it be organization, whether it be community, whether it be family, there's always emotion, because conflict comes when something has been triggered, and that might be our identity, that might be our values basis, that's something that's really important to us. So we are hurting, and I mean different degrees of hurt, obviously. So that needs kindness, that needs gentleness, that needs, I mean, again, Vikram, I go back to your safe space that you produce, and you know, within your safe space, you produce a gentleness and kindness towards people. You allow them to come with their ideas, and they're not all perfect. I mean, some of mine, I mean, if I was to look back on some of the ones I did, I'd probably go, oh my God, that's dreadful. But you allow that gentleness and kindness within that room to hear people's opinions and learnings. And as a result of that, you help build their confidence, you give them a sense of security, and then they develop. And they develop more as a mediator. And that's what we do when we're in the room of mediation. We allow that sense of kindness and gentleness, and we allow the participants to develop around in their communication skills. We allow them to develop their connection. You know, so that's what we're doing. That's what we do with our mediation language. So I just want to see now, there should be, sorry now, I think I should have another page for it. Oh,
yes, it was there.
Was there? Okay, yes. Sorry.
Yeah.
So again, I suppose the first line this brings me back. There's a great paper by Niels Christie, and it was wrote, I think, in it could be 1971 or something. And he came from a legal background, but it was, I think the title of it, Conflict as Property. I think that's the title of the paper. And it's basically that we own our own conflicts, but when we go into a courtroom, we hand over the ownership of that conflict to the judge, to the solicitors, to the system that is there. And actually what mediation does is it hands us back our ownership of conflict and allows us to learn and grow from that conflict. So I suppose really this kind of, I was thinking of you, Vikram, when I highlighted this thing. Men who despise you, enslave you, who regiment your lives, tell you what to do, what to think and what to feel, who drill you, diet you, treat you like cattle, use you as cannon fodder. Don't give yourselves to these unnatural men with machine minds and machine hearts. You are not machine. You are not cattle. You are men. You have the love of humanity in your hearts. You don't hate, only the unloved hate. And like, that's really, to me, is, you know, listening to a lot of our conversations over the last time, that really resonated with me, and some of the conversations we've had, Vikram, around that ownership of thing, and been trying to make mediation into a machine, and forgetting about the heart. And, you know, as human beings, we want to love, we want to connect, and it's about growing that connection. So really, to me, I found this speech so powerful. You, the people, have the power to create machines, the power to create happiness. And actually, again, Vikram, I was thinking of our conversations around, not looking at the news, creating your own world, creating your own environment, allowing your world to be happy, not allowing negativity to come into your world as best you can. I mean, life happens. We have to deal with things as they come up. But, really creating that environment for you. You, the people, have the power to make this life free and beautiful, to make this life a wonderful adventure. And I really think that if mediation is allowed to develop, if we're allowed to use the language of mediation, if we're allowed to incorporate the language of mediation into our societies, into our homes, into our workplaces, into our friendships, into everything that we have, it is a language of connection. It is a language of love, and it is a language of humanity. But it is a difficult language to learn. It's a difficult language to change. It's like we have become fluent in other languages. We have become fluent in judgment. We have become fluent in advising, an advisory type of role. We have become fluent in, I suppose, having opinions on people's achievements, having opinions on the way they live their lives, criticism, all those sorts of things. And look, it's very hard to unlearn those languages, because for so many people, they might have grown up with those languages. That might have been part of what they are. So that's their first language. That's their mother tongue. And when we move into the language of mediation, we are changing. We're moving from the mother tongue into a second language. And we're also moving to it as adult learners for some of us. And to learn as an adult is different than learning as a child as a first language. So we go back to the paper. We go back to the 5 stages of learning a new language. We create the learning environment. So if there is going to be learning environments around mediation, and I've been part of those learning environments, and I have been very lucky that the learning environments I was around and the mentors and the teachers I had were all about, a mindset change. They were all about incorporating it into your own life. They were all about reflective practice. They were all about growing as a person as you developed your skill as mediation. So I've been very lucky in the training I've received. And I think it's understanding that that's how you become fluent in a language. It's how we learn it. It's how we incorporate it. It's how we develop it, and how we keep learning, how we keep improving on our fluency, and being open to different dialects, to understand that people have different ways of saying the same things, of presenting in mediation. But what is important is that you'll still get the cup of tea. I'll still get the cup of tea if I go to your house, Vikram, and when you come to my home, you'll get a cup of tea as well. And we've asked in completely different ways. We're both getting the cup of tea. You're going to come and sit in my sitting room. I'll come and sit in your sitting room. I'll say, will you have a cuppa? And you'll say to me, would you like a cup of tea? And we're both reaching the same level of connection in different environments and in different dialects. And I think really that's why, understanding language in mediation is important, and not being afraid of it, and to try use it, to try it out. I know when I start changing my language in the house around my family, I think I said this to you before, or I could have, maybe it was Ken I had the conversation with, but it was, the kids used to call me, when they were children at the time, they used to call me Mammy 2.0. So they knew, they could notice the change. They laughed at it initially. They took them ages to get used to this new language, but I stuck with it. And what is interesting is I have a 16-year-old now who, with her friend, she's the youngest in the house, she has become a natural mediator. I see her sitting in at lunchtime with her friends, and they're coming to her with their woes with their other friends, and she's helping them. Well, okay, so what was that like for you? And God, I wonder what was going on for them. And and I'm going, wow, she has the language because she's learned it with her first language. So it's there. She will be a natural mediator. It's going to be in her. And I think that's what we have the power to do for the generations that come forward, is by incorporating this mediation language into our everyday life, into our schools, into our workplaces, that we will produce generations of natural mediators, where mediation is part of their first language, regardless of what culture it's in or what dialect it's in. So I suppose on that note, I'm going to end my presentation, Vikram, and I hope I didn't go off too much in a tangent.
No, you like always, you went into such a nice side of it. I think this particular speech, I'm going to like that in philosophy, I was quoting the definition you brought in. I think this we need to look at each aspect of it. The parts you marked, yes. Beyond that, also what is written there is very relevant in relation to mediation and development of mediation. I think really, but I think this last thing that you were talking about is even more interesting, about this becoming your mother language. In, like you said, in the house, if they pick it up there, because look, children pick up the language, they start speaking the language before they know any grammar. They don't know what a noun or a pronoun is. They're speaking to you all this time. You will show them, tell them about grammar much later. So they're picking up all these things. And this again comes from that evolution of a mediator part that I keep saying, that your value systems that you have in the house, what you have grown up in, what you see around you, you've picked up so much from there. And to say that, I mean, this can be put into you in whatever short time. Now I'm going to stop getting into this 40-hour factories. I'm not going to go there. But I just think that this mother language thing, I think, is really nice. I think today we should be looking at that what people pick up from mediations and take back and make it part of their language around them. And that's interesting. I think that's really interesting. And that's the thing, Andrea, you always bring up. Yep.
But you know, Vikram, I suppose I find it easier to talk to things that I can relate to, and that has been my own personal experience. But I always find that whatever topic you give me, it sends me on a path, and I'm thinking about it as stuff is coming up. So I learn as much from it, and it's a bit like the mediation we get. So even say coming today, I've learned so much from this. I mean, I watched Elan's presentation, I watched Michael's, I started watching oh gosh, I can't think of her name now. She's only, I think it was her first time to present. She said she was going through she was talking about separation.
Elyse.
What's her name?
Elyse. Yeah.
Elyse. So I actually started listening to Elyse's, so I'm through that. So I haven't watched everybody's. I will catch up on them. But it's interesting to listen to people's different perspectives and how they approach them. And I was actually, when I was listening to Michael's, he was saying, now I'm not really kind of going to go into reflective practice. And I actually, when I was finished putting mine together, I was saying, God, I've loads of reflective practice in that one. But I suppose it's the way I operate. Reflective practice, a bit like becoming fluent in things, and probably because I wrote my paper on it. To me, reflective practice was the vehicle that that allows for that paradigm shift, that allows, even though you might have had that mediator mindset, but allows you to start trusting that mediator mindset and incorporating the mediator mindset. So, and look, I've never done, a short program of mediation. Like, so I did mine over a long period of time. I went into deep kind of discovery because I was very much of the view, and this was me personally, it's not everybody, but that I wasn't comfortable. And again, it's a fear that you've spoke about. I wasn't comfortable going into the room to mediate until I had my stamp, and I had to go as far as having a master's, but I needed a stamp because I didn't have that belief that what I had was good enough. I needed that stamp to say, okay, you're not going to do any harm and you're okay to go into that room. So I suppose that was where I came from. But as you learn and as you're working in mediation, as you're developing those connections, you begin to trust your own skills more. You begin to understand, you begin to know why something works and why something doesn't work. And you begin to know what is important about you as a mediator and what are the values you bring as a mediator. And for me, the core value is connection. Is that sense of connection when I go into a mediation room. And it's about, making sure that connection is reached. And that changes for every single mediation you go into, because every single mediation you go into is different. Every single participant that you meet, even participants sounds real dishuman, like, but where every person you meet in a mediation room is different. They have a different background, they're different. So I think you learn that, and that comes with practice. That comes with, like learning your language, that comes by immersing yourself in mediation. That comes by learning. And sometimes you'll use the wrong phrase or you'll say the wrong thing, but it's taking ownership. It's actually saying, reflecting on that and saying, do you know what? That actually wasn't the right thing to do. And not being afraid to go back to people in the mediation room and say, how was that for you? Is that okay for you? Or does this feel like it's working for you? And say, do you know what? I was thinking about something that I said in the room the last time. And I'm just wondering, how did that sit with you? Because when I came out of the mediation room, it actually didn't sit okay with me. And I think allowing that humanness to come into a mediation room, that people kind of go, no, actually, that was fine with me. Like, sometimes it's you, it's about you, it's not about them. So I do think the topics you pick always send me down a road of discovery. So thank you for that, Vikram.
Good part is, and good part is you come out with, come back with gold. That's a good part in that discovery. But Andrea, now in terms of the Ireland mediation circle and your daughter, I think we have to involve her also. And the fact that what she's picked up, this is what she needs to communicate, that yes, this is something which is part of us. We can do it, because she has that confidence. She doesn't need any stamp. So I think that's a good person to have with us. So what are we doing about that? Are we doing something about
she's 16, Vikram, so they're not as easy to convince. Like, they're
should be very easy to convince.
They're a bit funny about things going out live on air, because
no. This is not, these circles are not going live. See, circles, we are doing work on the ground. So that this is actually getting people together and doing that. So I think we need her also. Of course, we need you. Let's do something there. Let's do something where actually we see some activity on the ground.
Yeah, we might actually get some, we might, we'll talk about it again, but what we might actually do is even get some of our friends and we'll do a piece on mediation even with our friends or something, and just get some feedback from them and how they found it.
Now it's actually them creating that circle and actually having your daughter being available to these people. Let's grow this into something that is a way of life. Let's do that instead of going into the direction that, oh, you have to go there, get qualified and all that. No, this is a way of life and you already have it, and let's create that environment around. Let's do that. Andrea, why are you so busy? Please take out some time for all.
I'm busy, Media. I have 2 mediations today, because I'll only be able to pop in and say hello to Ken at 5. I have a mediation at 6 that I have to travel to, so I have to leave here at 5:30. And then I have one at 1 o'clock today. And then tomorrow I'm looking after my mother tomorrow. Thursday I have 2 on Thursday as well. So I'm a busy mediator. So, which is good, because it means that more people are using mediation. It means that people are maybe starting to see that this actually is a better way, and maybe, rather than an alternative, maybe this is the first port to call before they go down any other route. And so that's a good thing, so that's always good. But it does take then from other stuff I'm doing. So I have to try, and there's not enough hours in the day, Vikram, for my love of this work. So I have to try and, squeeze it in some other way.
You have to take out time for this. Andrea, you owe this to the world. You owe this to the mediation world. And you, of course, I shouldn't say you owe it to me, but I need you for developing this. So.
Oh, and I'll do what I can. I promise you, whatever time I have, I'll give to you.
Perfect. So thank you, Andrea. Lovely talking to you. And of course, giving it a good direction.
I'll pop in at 5 o'clock and say hello.
Yeah. See you. Bye.
Thanks, Vikram.